The Netherlands in the autumn of 1942 smelled of coal smoke and wet cobblestone. Canal boats moved slowly through Amsterdam's waterways. Tram bells rang on schedule. Bakers opened their shutters before dawn, the same as always, and the smell of bread drifted down streets that looked almost normal, almost unchanged, if you did not look too carefully at the doorways. But if you looked at the doorways you would see the yellow stars. Six-pointed, stitched to coats and jackets, worn by men and women on their way to markets that would only sell them food between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. Worn by children on their way to schools that only Jews were permitted to attend. Worn in a country that had been occupied for more than 2 years, and where the mechanisms of persecution had been tightening, methodically, without pause, since the morning German forces crossed the border in May 1940. The occupation of the Netherlands was not a sudden eruption of violence. It was a process. Quiet, administrative, almost bureaucratic in its patience. First came the census. Dutch Jews were required to register with the occupation authorities. Most complied because compliance seemed reasonable at the time, and because the alternative was unclear, and because there were children to feed and jobs to hold and a sense that cooperating with paperwork was not the same as surrendering to something worse. Then came the exclusions. Jews removed from civil service positions. Jewish businesses placed under German administration. Jewish children barred from public schools. Jewish men forbidden from certain professions. Each restriction arrived as a new regulation, announced by poster or newspaper notice, absorbed and endured and folded into the compressed life that remained. By the summer of 1942, the Dutch Jewish community numbered roughly 140,000 people, the largest Jewish population proportionally in Western Europe. By the summer of 1942, the deportations had begun. The word used in German announcements was Arbeitseinsatz. Labor deployment. Men and women were told they were being sent east to work camps that needed labor. The reasoning was plausible enough, in the specific way that lies are designed to be plausible, close enough to reality that disagreement requires more certainty than most people have on a normal morning. The deportation trains left from the Westerbork transit camp in the northeastern Netherlands. Trains that departed on Tuesday mornings. Regular as a postal route. By September 1942, more than 20,000 Dutch Jews had been deported. By the end of that year the number would exceed 60,000. In a narrow house on the Keizersgracht Canal in Amsterdam, a woman named Elisabeth van Loon stood at her kitchen window and watched a family she recognized being walked down the street by 2 German officers and a Dutch policeman. The family had lived 4 houses away. She had nodded to them at the market. Their youngest daughter, a girl of perhaps 5 or 6 with dark braided hair, was carrying a doll by its arm, swinging it as she walked, the way children swing things without thinking, the way children move through the world before they understand that the world is watching them differently than it watches everyone else. Elisabeth van Loon was not Jewish. She was a schoolteacher. A Protestant. A woman who had never thought of herself as political, or brave, or particularly distinct from any other woman on any other canal street in any other Dutch city. She was 41 years old. She lived alone. She had a second bedroom. She closed the window and stood very still for a long moment. Then she went to find her neighbor, a man named Gerrit Kleinman, whom she knew was connected to people who knew things she did not know. She asked him a question. The question was simple. It contained only 8 words. If I had room, who would need it? What Elisabeth van Loon was asking to become part of was not yet a formal organization. It had no name in the autumn of 1942. It had no office, no stamps, no chain of command. It was a network built entirely from personal trust, from one person who knew another person who knew another, and it was constructed not from ideology but from the specific human discomfort of watching something wrong continue to happen while one still had a second bedroom, or a barn, or a space beneath the floorboards, or a farmhouse with an attic where the ceiling was low and the light came through a single crack. Historians would later call it the onderduik, the diving under. Those who went into hiding were the onderduikers, the ones who dove beneath the surface of ordinary life and disappeared. By 1943, there were an estimated 28,000 Jewish people in hiding across the Netherlands. Hidden in farmhouses in Friesland. In convents in Utrecht. In basements in Rotterdam. In attics in Amsterdam. In hayfields and cattle barns and narrow closets behind false walls. They were in hiding because someone had chosen to hide them. Someone who understood what discovery would mean, not only for the person concealed but for themselves. The German occupation's penalties for hiding Jews were not administrative. They were not fines or revocations or expulsions. They were imprisonment. They were deportation. They were death. And yet people did it anyway. The question historians still return to is not only why. The question is how. How does a family maintain a secret of that magnitude in a house surrounded by neighbors for months? For years? How does a child learn to exist in a space without being detected? How does a woman who has just hidden 3 people in her attic go down to answer the door when a German officer knocks, and stand in the cold morning light and say with a steady voice and steady eyes, "No. There is no one here." The answer in most cases was not courage alone. The answer was silence. Hanna Bloch was 8 years old when her parents brought her to a farmhouse outside the town of Barneveld, in the province of Gelderland, in the spring of 1943. She had never met the farmer or his wife before. She had traveled with her father for 3 hours in the back of a vegetable delivery truck, pressed against wooden crates, not speaking. Her father had held her hand for the entire journey. When the truck stopped and the door opened and a man she did not recognize helped her down into the cold air of a farmyard at dusk, her father hugged her very tightly and said something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "From now on, you are the sound of nothing. You understand? Not a whisper. Not a cough. When you are in the room, no one knows you are in the room. Then he got back into the truck. She did not see him again for 19 months. The protocols of hiding were learned rapidly because they had to be. There was no rehearsal period. There was no gradual adjustment. The moment a person entered a hiding place, the rules of their existence changed absolutely. No movement during the day if neighbors could hear. In some farmhouses, that meant no walking on wooden floors between sunrise and the hour when the farmhands left in the evening. In row houses in Amsterdam, where the walls were thin enough to hear conversation from next door, it meant sitting still in one position for hours at a time, on a mattress with a book or without one. No flushing of toilets during critical hours. In some hiding places, a bucket. The mechanics of concealment extended into every physical process, every bodily need, every ordinary human act that generates sound. No windows opened. Even in summer. Even when the heat inside a closed attic in July became the kind of heat that makes thinking difficult. No coughing. When illness came, and in cramped, poorly ventilated hiding places, it came frequently, those who were hiding learned to suppress coughs against cloth, against pillows, against the palms of their hands, turning the sound inward until nothing escaped. Children who were hiding sometimes developed the habit so completely that they could no longer cough normally even after the war. The body had been trained to swallow its own reflexes. No crying. This is the rule that appears most frequently in survivor testimonies from those who were hidden as children. The suppression of crying. The training, sometimes gentle, sometimes desperate, that a sound as natural as a child's crying, as universal as hunger or loneliness or fear, had become something that could get everyone in the house killed. A woman named Miriam Feldstein, who was hidden at age 4 with a Dutch farm family in Holland and survived to give testimony decades later, described the first rule she was taught in hiding. She said her host mother, a woman she knew only as Tante Bep, sat with her on the first night and held both of her hands and looked at her very steadily and explained something that a 4-year-old cannot fully understand but can somehow absorb, the way children absorb everything, through repetition and tone and the specific gravity of an adult's expression when they are telling you something true. Tante Bep told her, "When you want to cry you breathe like this," and she showed her. Slow, controlled, through the nose. Hold it. Release it. Like the breathing of someone almost asleep. You do that until the crying goes away. Miriam Feldstein said she practiced it every night for weeks. She said she became very good at it. She said she became so good at it that she was still doing it 70 years later, in moments of grief, breathing slowly until the feeling passed without making a sound. The families who hid people learned their own disciplines of silence. For the helpers, the challenge was not suppressing instinct but maintaining performance. Every day was a performance, a sustained, unbroken act of normalcy conducted under conditions of extreme stress. They answered doors. They received deliveries. They spoke with neighbors who dropped by for coffee, sitting in kitchens where the ration cards of additional people were hidden beneath floorboards, where extra food was distributed in portions calculated to leave no visible excess, where the toilet in the hallway had been used by someone else an hour before and the window of the spare bedroom was kept precisely as dark as it had always been. The German security apparatus in the Netherlands was not undiscerning. The Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence arm of the SS, employed Dutch informants in large numbers. Neighbors who suspected hiding were sometimes willing to report it, motivated by ideology or personal grievance, or the financial reward that the occupation authorities offered. 7.50 guilders per Jewish person discovered in hiding, later raised to 40 guilders as the deportations accelerated and the number of the hidden grew. The helpers knew this. They knew that the neighbor who smiled pleasantly across the garden fence might have a different conversation the following morning with someone they would never meet. They knew that one misfired moment, a child's voice through a wall, a silhouette at the wrong window, a ration card slightly too many, could collapse everything. And so they performed. Day after day. Season after season. A grocer named Willem de Graaf, who hid 7 people in the cellar of his shop in Utrecht for 14 months and survived to be honored after the war, was asked once how he had maintained the performance for so long without breaking. He thought about the question for a long moment. Then he said, "You do not think about the whole of it. If you thought about 14 months you would never survive 1 week. You think about this morning. You think about the door you are about to open. You make your face right. You open it, *. There were rules for the hidden that extended beyond sound. There were rules about light. No candle near a window after dark. No reading lamp visible from the street. In some hiding places, no light at all during certain hours, the hidden sitting in complete darkness, measuring time by the sounds coming from below, the clink of dishes at dinner, the creak of the house settling into sleep. There were rules about smell. Cooking could not be done in hiding spaces. Food was brought up at designated times. In winter, this sometimes meant cold meals because the smell of warm food drifting from a location that was supposed to be empty was a form of evidence. There were rules about footprints in snow, about shadows visible through gaps in shutters, about the disposal of waste, about the management of illness, about the specific timing and angle of a door that could not be allowed to swing open at a moment when a delivery man's line of sight was wrong. These rules accumulated. They became the architecture of an entire second existence. A parallel life built entirely from what was not done, what was not said, what did not exist. Hanna Bloch, the 8-year-old from Barneveld, spent the first 3 months of her hiding period in a small room above the farmhouse's cold cellar. The room had a low ceiling, a straw mattress and a single shelf with 3 books on it, none of which she had chosen and one of which, a Dutch Protestant hymnal, she read so many times she memorized it without intending to. She later said she was not particularly religious. She said she simply needed words to look at. She said the hymnal was all there was. She passed time by counting things. The number of boards in the ceiling above her head. The number of knotholes in the walls. The number of times she heard the farmer's wife go to and from the kitchen in the course of a morning. She developed an ability to identify people by footstep alone, the farmer's heavy, deliberate tread, his wife's lighter, quicker rhythm, the son who came on weekends whose step dragged slightly at the left heel. She learned to read the sounds of the house the way a blind person reads a space. Completely. Without error. In Amsterdam, the resistance network that organized much of the city's hiding activity operated under the informal name the Naamloos Vennootschap, the NV, meaning the Anonymous Company. It was led in part by a man named Joop Westerwiel, a schoolteacher and committed pacifist who had been moved, as Elisabeth van Loon had been moved, not by ideology but by the specific reality of what was happening to people he knew. Westerwiel coordinated routes, documents and safe houses across the Netherlands and into Belgium and France. He worked through networks of contacts, each of whom knew only the parts of the network they needed to know, a principle of deliberate compartmentalization that reduced the damage that could be done by any single arrest. He was arrested in March 1944 by the SD and executed at the Voet concentration camp in August of that year. He was 43 years old. The people he had helped, many of them were still in hiding when he was killed. The hiding network in the Netherlands also extended into the religious institutions of the country, in ways that were not always officially sanctioned, and that required their own particular forms of concealment. Convents in Utrecht, Haarlem and Nijmegen took in Jewish children under the cover of charitable work. Children arrived as orphans, as displaced relatives, as the offspring of deceased Catholic families, identities constructed from forged documents that the resistance printed in basements on equipment smuggled from Germany, stamped with seals they had carved by hand from rubber, notarized by men who were risking death for each signature. Inside the convents, the nuns who knew told the nuns who didn't know as little as possible. The children who were Jewish were not identified to the broader community. They attended chapel services, memorized prayers they had not grown up with, responded to names that were not theirs. They learned a different kind of silence there. Not the silence of hiding from sound, but the silence of hiding from identity. They became, in performance, someone else. They folded the person they had been into a smaller and smaller space inside themselves, and presented the required face to the required world. The raid on a farmhouse in the province of Utrecht happened on a Thursday morning in February 1944. It was unexpected, these things usually were. A Dutch informant had reported activity to the local SD office. The informant's information was partial, possibly second-hand, possibly exaggerated. None of that mattered. The information was enough. 3 SD officers arrived before 8 in the morning with a Dutch constable. They knocked on the door, which was answered by the farmer's wife, a woman named Grietje Hofman, 44 years old, who had been hiding 3 Jewish people in a concealed room beneath her pantry floor for 7 months. She opened the door. She said, "Good morning." She said it with a face she had been preparing for 7 months. The officers entered the house. They walked through the kitchen. They opened cabinet doors and looked inside. They moved furniture. They tapped walls with their knuckles, listening for the hollow note that means something is on the other side. They went upstairs and checked the bedrooms. They came back down and stood in the pantry. In the concealed room beneath the pantry floor, 3 people, a man named Abraham Vogel, his wife Lena and their daughter Rivka, who was 12 years old, lay flat on their backs in the dark and did not breathe. Not metaphorically. Literally. In moments of extreme danger, some of those in hiding had developed the ability to slow their own bodies, to compress their breathing until it was nearly undetectable, to suspend the sound of their own living. Rivka Vogel, in testimony given 50 years later, described the Thursday morning in February as the moment she felt most alive and most like something not living at the same time. She described hearing the knock of an officer's knuckle on the pantry floor directly above her head, 2 feet from her face. She said she held her breath for so long that her vision began to fill with white light from the edges. The officers left. They did not find the concealed room. Grietje Hofman closed the front door behind them, walked back to the kitchen, sat down at the table and did not move for a long time. She said later to her own daughter, that in that moment she understood that courage was not a feeling she had. It was only an action. She had done the thing without the feeling. She said she was not sure whether that made it more frightening or less. Not all raids ended that way. In Amsterdam in the spring of 1944, a family that had been hiding on the Prinsengracht Canal for 2 years was discovered on a morning in early June. They were taken that day to the SD headquarters on Uterpestrit, and from there to Westerbork and from there east. What happened to them is documented. What happened to the woman who had hidden them, who had brought them food and managed their documents and stood in her own doorway telling composed lies for 2 years, is also documented. She was arrested the same morning. She spent the remainder of the war in German detention. She survived. What happened to her in the years afterward? The silence she carried, the specific shape of the guilt of having survived when those she had protected had not, is less documented. This is the kind of consequence that does not appear in official records. The kind that continues long after the last registry is closed. For the children who were hidden, the consequences of silence were written not in records but in the body. Children who spent formative years in hiding emerged from the war having been built, in part, by that experience. The disciplines of silence, the compressed breathing, the learned stillness, the suppression of grief and fear and ordinary need, did not dissolve when the hiding ended. They had become part of the structure of those children. Part of how they moved through rooms. Part of how they managed emotion. Miriam Feldstein, the woman who had been hidden at 4 years old and learned Tante peace breathing exercises, spent the first years after the war being described by teachers and relatives as unusually quiet, as self-contained, as a child who never seemed to need anything, which was understood in the early post-war years as a sign of resilience, of a child who had come through difficulty and emerged whole. It took decades for her to understand that it was not wholeness, it was training. She had been trained not to need things audibly. She had been trained so well that she sometimes could not access what she needed even privately, even in the silence of her own mind, even after the war had been over for 30 years. She said the war had not taken her voice. It had taught her voice that it was dangerous. And that was a harder thing to undo. Hanna Bloch was reunited with her father in October 1944, 8 months before the formal liberation of the Netherlands. She was 9 years old when she entered the farmer's cellar. She was 10 when she left it. Her father had survived in hiding in a different location. Her mother had not. She learned this the same day she saw her father again, standing in a farmyard in Gelderland in October light, with the smell of mud and late harvest wheat around her, and her father walking toward her with a face that was trying to be something it could not quite become, and everything she understood about what had happened arriving in the space between one breath and the next. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. She stood very still and breathed slowly through her nose, the way Tante BP had taught her, until the thing that wanted to be a sound became only pressure, and then became nothing. Her father held her for a long time. She kept breathing. The war in the Netherlands officially ended on May 5, 1945, when German forces in the country capitulated following 5 years of occupation. The liberation came through the western provinces in April, following months of what survivors called the Hunger Winter of 1944 and 1945, when German authorities blocked food supplies to the occupied Western Netherlands in retaliation for a Dutch railway strike, and an estimated 18,000 to 22,000 Dutch civilians starved to death. Among those who survived were the onderduikers who had spent months or years in concealment, emerging into a country that was simultaneously freed and devastated. They came out of cellars and attics and barn spaces and walked into a world that was attempting to reassemble itself from the debris of 5 years of occupation. The reception was not always what they might have hoped. The Netherlands in 1945 was a country focused on survival, on reconstruction, on the practical emergencies of feeding and housing a population that had been through extraordinary deprivation. There was not much room in the immediate post-war period for the specific grief of the hidden. The number of Dutch Jews who survived the war was approximately 38,000. Out of the roughly 140,000 who had been living in the Netherlands when the Germans arrived. The majority of those who survived had done so in hiding. Their survival was statistical evidence of what the hiding had accomplished. It was also the only evidence in many cases of what the helpers had risked. The woman named Grietje Hofman, who held her face composed in her own doorway on a February morning while officers searched her pantry floor, lived until 1987. She was recognized by Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Authority, as one of the righteous among the nations in 1968. The medal she received was the standard form of recognition offered to non-Jews who had risked their lives to protect Jews during the Holocaust. She accepted it at a ceremony in The Hague attended by her children and several of the people her family had helped to hide. She said, in the brief remarks she was asked to give at the ceremony, that she did not think of herself as someone who had done something extraordinary. She said extraordinary was a word for things that required a quality she did not believe she possessed. She said she had simply done the next thing that seemed necessary, in the specific morning it was necessary, and then the next morning and the one after that. She said, anyone can be afraid and still do the thing. Afraid is not the same as unable. Then she sat down and she did not elaborate. Rivka Vogel, the 12-year-old who had held her breath in the dark while an officer's knuckle struck the floor above her face, became a psychologist. She specialized in trauma therapy. She practiced in Utrecht for more than 30 years. She had a particular reputation among colleagues for her ability to work with patients who could not articulate what had happened to them, patients for whom the experience existed not in language but in the body, in the held breath and the compressed posture and the old reflexes that activated without invitation in rooms that felt suddenly dangerous. She understood something about the body's memory that was not taught in any textbook she had read. She understood that survival can become a habit, and that habits formed under extreme conditions are not easily retired. That the self built in hiding, the self that learned to take up no space, to produce no sound, to need nothing, to wait, does not simply dissolve when the hiding ends. She said in an interview given late in her life that she believed the most lasting damage of the occupation was not what it had done to bodies, or to families, or to the material world. It was what it had done to people's relationship with their own existence. Their right to take up space. Their right to make noise. Their right to be present in the world without apology and without calculation. She said, when you teach someone that their existence is dangerous, you change what existence means to them. Even after the danger is gone, existence feels like something that requires justification. She paused. She said, that is what they took. Not only the years. These, Hanna Bloch grew up. She married. She had 3 children. She lived for many years in Amsterdam, in a house with large windows that she preferred to keep open. She spoke at schools in the 1970s and 1980s, as part of a growing movement among survivors and the children of survivors to document and transmit what had happened before the generation who remembered it was gone. She was not a dramatic speaker. She did not arrange her testimony for effect. She described things precisely: the low ceiling of the room above the cold cellar, the 3 books on the shelf, the hymnal she had memorized without intending to, the counting of the ceiling boards, the sound of the farmer's wife's footsteps measured against the duration of the morning. She described learning to breathe until the crying stopped. She described the October afternoon in the farmyard and her father's face, and the pressure that became nothing. When students asked her how she had survived, she thought for a moment before answering. She did not want to give the wrong answer. She wanted to give the true one. She said, many people protected me. And I protected myself by being very small. By making no sound. By being, for a long time, as little as possible. She looked at the students. She said, after the war the work was the opposite. Learning to be large again. Learning that the room did not need to be silent for me to be safe in it. She said she was still learning. The network that hid people during the occupation of the Netherlands is estimated to have involved somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 Dutch helpers. Men and women who took the deliberate risk of concealment and sustained it, in some cases for years, with the knowledge that discovery meant death. Some of them were part of organized resistance structures. Many were not. Many were simply individuals who had a second room or a barn or a section of floor that could be lifted, and who made the decision, one morning, one afternoon, one evening, that they would rather die for the right thing than survive for the wrong one. Their names are not widely known. The architecture of concealment that protected them, and the people they protected, required that names not be widely known. The system worked because it was anonymous. Because no single person held all the information. Because the silence was not only the silence of the hidden, it was the silence of the helpers too. A deliberate, chosen, sustained silence that was itself a form of protection. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. That does not raise a flag or fire a weapon or write a manifesto. It is the courage of continuing. Of opening a door with a composed face when every instinct is screaming otherwise. Of sitting in the dark and choosing not to breathe. It is the courage of understanding that what you do in the quiet, private moment, when no one is watching, when there is no witness, when the calculation of self-interest and the calculation of what is right have diverged completely, is the truest expression of who you actually are. In the Netherlands, between 1942 and 1945, ordinary people built a world of silence beneath the visible world. They built it from floorboards and straw and borrowed ration cards and carefully managed faces. They sustained it through winter and summer and the specific terror of Thursday mornings. They passed food through gaps in walls and breathed slowly through their noses and counted the boards in their ceilings and held the people they loved in memory like a sound that could not yet be made. They were not heroes in the way the word is usually meant. They were farmers and schoolteachers and grocers and nuns. They were children who had been told to be the sound of nothing and who complied because compliance was the only gift left to give. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, doing the only thing that seemed possible when everything that should have protected the world had failed to do so. They stayed quiet. And in the quiet, somehow they kept each other alive. Hanna Bloch died in 2009 at the age of 76. She is buried in Amsterdam. On her gravestone, her children placed a single line, taken from the Protestant hymnal she had memorized in a farmhouse in Gelderland, in a room with a low ceiling and 3 books on a shelf, in the silence that protected her. The line reads, "Bewar mij als het oog in uw hand." Keep me as the pupil in your hand. The kind of line that means different things depending on who is reading it, and when and how quiet the room is when they do. For the 28,000 who went under. For the 25,000 who kept them there. And for what was asked of all of them, and given,